Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Ladin Neurotech.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's guest is Paul Goode from Glucotrack, and we actually met in Barcelona a few months ago now at the Active Implantable Medical Device Conference, but it was kind of like a workshop. But whatever. And it was mostly neurotech, but Paul's company is an implantable glucose sensor, which goes away from the wearable sensors or pricking your finger to measure your glucose. And so you have a continuous glucose monitor. And I believed it lasted for many years and has some advantages over the wearable sensors, which, although much more convenient, are still inconvenient for those who need to track their glucose. So, Paul, I tried to introduce you as well as I can. Do you want to clarify some of the things I might have messed up?
Sure. No, you did a great job. Yeah, again, at Glucotrack, we're measuring glucose continuously, and as many folks are aware, there are patients who you may see people who have diabetes who wear these little things on the back of their arm and to measure glucose continuously. And those are wonderful products, and they've done a lot for these patients. I have a grandson, by the way, who wears one. But not everybody can wear them, and not everybody wants to wear them. And this is for a collection of different reasons. But when you look at those reasons, one reason or another is the fact that it's wearable. They don't want people to see it, or they don't want to manage it all the time, or the adhesive itches, or the device falls off, or they're on day 10 of 14 day sensor life, and they want to go to the beach or swimming, but they can't because then they have to take the sensor off, things like that. And so our product is a fully implantable, and that's where we met, was at Layden and I met. It was at an active implantable device workshop, and I was giving a presentation on our device, and it's a fully implantable device that lasts for 3 years and measures the patient's glucose continuously.
Excellent. Yeah, so this is the Neural Implant Podcast. We talk about neurotechnology. Why would a glucose sensor be invited to come on the show? Why did we end up catching up later on? Do you want to talk about why?
Yeah. Good question. And actually, and even more so, because not only are we measuring glucose, but our conventional, our sort of our flagship product, I should say, the one that we're in clinical trials for and working towards FDA approval, is actually an intravascular, glucose sensor, so it measures directly in the blood. But on our journey, we were at the American Diabetes Association conference in 2023, and we saw there that a spinal cord stimulator company, a company by the name of Nevro, one of the top spinal cord stimulator companies, had a huge booth presence there, and it was a big head scratcher. Long story short, I found out that spinal cord stimulator companies who treat lower limb and lower back pain as their primary, they began to realize that, well, there's a large portion of patients with diabetes who wind up with what's called painful diabetic neuropathy. And that's where the bottom of their feet begin to tingle and burn and hurt and eventually go numb. And it is a bit of a downward cycle, a downward spiral, in that these patients, unfortunately, move less and less, and then they get less blood flow there, and eventually it can lead to amputation and immobility and so forth. So it's very costly to the healthcare system. Anyhow, Nevro decided to do a randomized control trial, and kudos to them. It's a very marvelously designed trial. And they said, look, we got a spinal cord stimulator that treats lower limb pain, and let's stack that up against how patients or how physicians are managing these patients, which is with medication. And so they did a randomized control trial, and boy, their results were just far superior. I mean, it really sort of blew away most everybody's expectations. So they published the data. They went to the FDA, said, can we get an indication to treat these patients? The FDA said, well, this is great. Yeah, go ahead. And then, of course, one by one, Medtronic and Abbott and Boston, they all went for the same indication. And so they're actually continue to treat these patients. Nevro has continued to follow these patients, and they've done more studies, and they've actually found that something that was never thought that could be done before in painful diabetic neuropathy, which is they can actually reverse the neuropathy, which was a bit of a new finding. And in addition, to that, patients, because they're getting their sensation back, they're moving around, they're walking, So they're losing weight, their blood sugars are dropping. So it's a win-win all around. So again, I'm not trying to, be the salesman for Nevro, but I do want to give credit where credit is due, and they're the pioneers who really showed how good this technology is. Now, where we come in is, our device, it's I mentioned earlier, it's an intravascular device, and this is the electronics and the battery, and it lays here in the chest, and then there's a lead, that goes into the blood vessel. About 1 millimeter diameter, it goes into the blood vessel. But this lead is very, very, very similar to a spinal cord stimulator lead in its materials and construction. So we thought, gosh, wouldn't it be nice if patients, for the device that they have that manages their pain, that they could also get a glucose measurement out of it. But we couldn't find anywhere under the sun where somebody had tried to do glucose sensing in the epidural space where these spinal cord stimulator leads reside. We searched the patent literature, we searched the academic literature, we searched device companies, and so we just said, well, let's go ahead and try it. And so we did a short animal study, a few hours, and found out, wow, this actually, you can measure glucose continuously in the epidural space. And we repeated that a few times. And then we decided, all right, let's do a long-term study. So we ran one study out a couple of months and got really phenomenal results. So that's how, when I met Leighton, and Leighton and I met in Barcelona, we were just chatting after one of the sessions, and this came up and said, well, this might be a good thing to share with the neurotech community.
Yeah, it's really exciting. And this is something that you guys had, like you said, done some work on, some animal experiments and potentially thinking about, right, like licensing out or working with existing companies that are already implanted, in the cerebral spinal fluid space, but just adding this, maybe sacrificing a few electrodes in order to measure this glucose. How much is it? Is it some kind of coding? How many electrodes do they have to sacrifice to be able to do this? What are the specs of being able to read glucose?
That's a very good question. So the idea is, yeah, that they could effectively use their existing spinal cord stimulator leads, which they usually have, 8 to 16 electrodes on these leads. And so there is a chemistry that goes on a couple of these electrodes, or one of these electrodes, not a couple. We do need a couple more. So we need a total of 3 electrodes out of the 8 or out of the 16 that they normally have. Or of course, these leads, it can be extended and you can add 3 electrodes. But effectively, it's the same materials, and the same type of electrode. We just put a chemistry on it, and then it goes in, the exact same way.
Yeah, that's really exciting. I know a lot of other materials that you can measure, like hydrogen sulfide or carbon monoxide, everything like this. You do different like cyclic voltammetry, different tricks of, voltages and currents and spikes and everything like this to be able to tease it out, and of course coding. So it really is amazing to see this. And then it is kind of surprising to know that, cerebral spinal fluid also reacts to glucose. Of course, not as maybe as fast as blood or as accurate as blood, but I mean, it also makes sense because these wearable continuous glucose monitors, they're not in the blood, they're, in the fat, right? So a lot of times they are a few minutes behind the measurements, but they are very accurate. How does your measurements compare to continuous glucose monitor? Maybe it's not as accurate or as fast as what's in the blood, but is there a time delay? Is there some kind of accuracy sacrifice that you're dealing with?
Yeah, good question. So the conventional CGMs, those back of the arm devices, they are measuring, like you said, under the skin and not in the blood. So they're laying in what's called the interstitial space or subcutaneous tissue interstitial space, which is perfused by the capillary beds. And because it's perfused by the capillary beds, then into the interstitial space and then onto the sensor, there is, typically you don't, in low rates of change and in low glucose dynamics, you don't really see a delay. However, when there are rapid rates of change, such as like when you're exercising or after you've eaten a meal, or if you're stressed or if you're sick, so this can happen, a few times a day, then you have rapid rises and falls, and that's when it's important. And you can see delays, upwards around 10 minutes. And you may think 10 minutes is not that big of a deal, but if you could dose insulin 10 minutes sooner, then, you're turn that curve around much sooner and you're you're not above the threshold for a longer period of time. And also, of course, same thing as you're falling, which is the more dangerous when your your glucose levels drop. You want to rebound them as fast as possible, otherwise you can get dizzy, pass out, and so forth. So that tenderness can be important. So in our case, when you stick this into the epidural space, it's actually laying on top of, the dura mater or dura mater. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that properly, but so there's the dura that is around the spinal column and it holds all the cerebrospinal fluid. So this lays on top of the dura mater, and so it's effectively like in the interstitial space. And so based upon when we did our studies, we had a conventional CGM in the subcutaneous space, and we had this at the same time, and we found that we were, just at the same time, same responsiveness as the conventional CGM. So our conclusions was that, yeah, that tissue compartment, that space is relatively similar to the CGM. Now, one thing you made a comment about, Leighton, is that you're like, wow, who would have thought that sugars are there? So interestingly is that your brain runs off of sugar. So you're going to have a lot of sugar in your CSF. And of course, then that needs to get there, from your body. And so that goes through the door. So that's another driver as to why oh yeah, makes sense. Should be sugar around there. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Also, so the reason your body tries, if blood sugar spikes very high, it tries to drop it very quickly. It almost panics because sugar in the, cellular space is quite toxic and is quite damaging. Does this mean that in the cerebrospinal fluid, this is also causing some kind of damage potentially to those surrounding cells? Do you know anything about that?
That's a very good question. And yeah, typically, I don't know I'll be quite frank, I don't know the impact that it has directly on, spinal cord cells or brain cells. But the fact that having excess sugar around, because, insulin is what converts, allows the sugar to go into the cells to be used for energy. So if you don't have insulin and your sugars just rise and you're sort of bathing in sugar, if you will, that's why there's so many comorbidities like cardiovascular problems and renal problems and neuropathy problems, as I mentioned earlier, is because it is damaging those organs in particular.
Yeah, so theoretically, it could be damaging the brain as well, if that's the case. Yeah, so this is great. So what's your guys' next step? I mean, you are mainly focused on your implantable glucose sensor. That's what you're trying to get through FDA, right? But you're kind of doing this on the side and looking for collaborators or having already done a collaboration, or what are the next steps?
Yeah, we are going to be looking, at some point, yeah, and this kind of goes back to a question or comment you maybe made earlier, like, what are you going to do with this? Because we definitely don't want to become a spinal cord stimulator company, but we would like to what's the word I'm looking for, augment, an existing technology, again, so the patient has one procedure, one device, and gets two benefits. So we would, like to at some point work with a spinal cord stimulator company to integrate this into their platform. The electronics are incredibly minimal. You mentioned cyclical photometry earlier. This is an electrochemical sensor. It uses a very simple potentiostat circuit. So, and the addition into, their electronics is absolutely minimal. And then adding, either using or adding a three electrodes is also negligible. So we would like to work with them. We think it probably would be better for us, so we can grab their attention, is to have some first in human data. And so we are looking at that as we speak as to the pathways to get that. We are in discussions with a particular physician collaborator and to see if we can get that through a local hospital IRB. And because as you know, the spinal cord stimulator companies, every patient has to go already through a percutaneous trial. They take one of these leads, they stick it in the epidural space in the spinal column, and then it comes out of the skin, and on the other side, it connects to a device that's taped to the body, and the patient walks around for, depending on the physician, a week or two or three to see if the stimulation therapy will help them. If it will, then that's removed and a fully implanted system is used. So we think that, from a trial perspective, this would be exactly the same as that percutaneous trial or a short-term stimulator approach. And so there would be incredibly, very, very minimal risk compared to what they already sign up for. So we think we can get that, hopefully, with any luck, get that through a local IRB and do a clinical trial. And at that point, we'd have some first in human data and showing that this is doable, and then maybe attract the attention of one of the key players.
Yeah, that's pretty exciting. Basically, you could even, yeah, I mean, you obviously it needs to be powered by some kind of electronics, some kind of controller, but you don't have to go through the effort of miniaturizing that and making it, hermetic and human grade and everything like this if it is external. So you could like almost clip on a new piece of electronics. So it could be pretty simple. But yeah, this is pretty good. I mean, I just hope it doesn't take away the focus of, the true part of your business. I mean, especially with small pre-approval, companies, the medical device companies, focus is everything, and you only have a certain amount of money, and you don't want to run out of that. But it is promising, and it does show that, even non-conventional, like, oh, we're implanted in the, cerebrospinal area, or it's a neurotechnology. Well, you can also do these other measurements that you wouldn't expect, frankly. So that's pretty exciting. But yeah, hopefully it goes well. And is there anything that you want to ask of the Neural Implant Podcast community?
Well, I guess I'd like to ask, well, somewhat of an ask, somewhat of a statement, I guess. I mean, two things. One is, you know, with the cost of healthcare, and of course the risks associated with implantable devices that, or any procedure, I should say, whether you're putting an implantable device or not, there's, if there's ways to synergize, multiple therapies or multiple, treatments, if you will, it seems like we should strive to do that. We should look for these opportunities, and that's what this particular is trying to merge two things into one product and one procedure. And I'm sure there are other opportunities like that. And so, again, I'm not a spinal cord stimulator expert by any stretch of the imagination and all the different types of indications that can happen. But I would imagine that there may be other applications that the community could think of that could leverage the existing platform. The patient has already decided to have an implant, to manage your pain, and pain is a very powerful motivator. So if there's something else that can be added to that device, I'd like to, challenge the neurotech community to think about access to that space. And then, of course, that would drive, obviously, the companies.
Yeah. I think it's exciting. Yeah, especially you're right. Like the patient's already going through this huge process, implant, and if you can piggyback, other things onto the same process, then why not? It's, especially if it's FDA approved and proved efficacious and therapeutic and all this kind of stuff. So, Paul, thanks so much. This has been great. A nice little introduction to this, and I wish you the best of luck, and potentially with these human trials, and hopefully we can get the word out about this exciting technology.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much. And thanks for all the great questions.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.